It's kind of sudden, but are you Elvis Presley by any chance?
You know,
You don't need Paul, you don't need Peter, you don't need Cephas, you don't need Elvis, you need Jesus.
It didn't start with a press conference. It didn't start with a headline or a breaking news alert or some carefully crafted statement released through a publicist. It started with a cell phone. A shaky, low-resolution cell phone video filmed inside a modest Baptist church in Benton, Arkansas. The kind of church where the parking lot has potholes and the congregation knows each other by first name and nobody expects anything they witness on a Sunday morning to ever leave those four walls. But something did leave those walls. Something that once it hit the internet could not be contained, could not be explained away, and could not be ignored no matter how hard the rational mind tried. The video was simple. A man stood at the front of the church and sang. That's it. No pyrotechnics, no stadium lighting, no backing band with a horn section. Just a man, a microphone, and a voice. And the moment that voice filled the room, something happened to the people watching that video from thousands of miles away that they genuinely could not explain. Their breath caught. They leaned forward. Some of them rewound it. Some of them played it for their spouses without saying a single word first, just to watch the reaction on their faces. And the reaction was always the same. Eyes wide. A slow turn. Who is that? Because the voice didn't just sound good. It didn't just sound powerful or rich or unusually gifted for a small-town preacher in the American South. It sounded like someone specific. It sounded like someone the entire world already knew. Someone who had sold over 1 billion records. Someone who had shaken his hips on national television and sent an entire generation into a frenzy. Someone who had lived and burned and consumed himself in front of the world and then allegedly died on the bathroom floor of Graceland on August 16, 1977. The voice coming out of that Arkansas church sounded, to an almost disorienting degree, like Elvis Aaron Presley. And the internet did what the internet always does when it finds something it cannot immediately categorize. It lost its mind. Within days, the video had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. Within weeks, it had been dissected, frame by frame and note by note, by people who had no credentials and no agenda beyond the simple, burning need to understand what they were hearing. Amateur vocal analysts uploaded comparison videos, playing clips of Bob Joyce's sermons side by side with recordings of Elvis from the 1970s, and the similarities were not subtle. They were not the kind of similarities you could hand-wave away with a shrug and a comment about regional accents. They were deep. Structural. The kind of similarities that live in the bones of a voice, in the way certain vowels get stretched, in the way certain notes get caught and held just a half beat longer than they need to be, in a warmth and a weight that professional singers spend entire careers trying to manufacture and almost never actually achieve. The conspiracy forums ignited. Reddit threads ran to hundreds of pages. YouTube channels dedicated entirely to this single question began accumulating subscribers by the thousands. People who had never once believed that Elvis faked his death in 1977 suddenly found themselves on those forums at 2 a.m, clicking link after link, reading theory after theory, unable to stop because each piece of evidence was just compelling enough to keep the next click feeling necessary. And the people who had always believed Elvis was still alive, and there are more of them than most people realize, felt something close to vindication. Because here was a face and a voice that matched their faith in a way nothing else ever quite had. But here's what made this story genuinely different from every other Elvis conspiracy that had come and gone over the decades. Bob Joyce was not hiding. He was not a shadowy figure operating under a false identity in some remote corner of the country. Bob Joyce doesn't just sound like Elvis when he sings. He carries himself with a specific kind of charisma, warm, self-aware, effortlessly magnetic, that feels less like personality and more like muscle memory. There's a way he tilts his head slightly when he's making a point, a particular rhythm in how he moves between humor and sincerity mid-sentence, a physical ease in front of an audience that most people spend entire careers trying to manufacture and never quite achieve. These are not things you practice into existence, visible only in grainy photographs and secondhand accounts. He was standing at the front of a church every single Sunday, leading his congregation in worship, shaking hands, giving sermons, living his life in full view of anyone who wanted to come and look. His church, Benton First Baptist, was not a secret. His name was not a secret. And yet, the more visible he was, the more the mystery seemed to deepen rather than dissolve, because seeing him in person only made the question louder, not quieter. And through all of it, through the viral videos and the conspiracy threads and the comparison reels and the people who drove hours just to sit in a pew and stare at him while he preached, Bob Joyce said almost nothing. Not a formal denial, not an angry rebuttal, not a press release, not an interview. He kept his head down, kept serving his church, kept singing those hymns in that voice that half the internet was convinced belonged to the most famous man who ever lived. For years, his silence was the loudest thing about him. Until now. Because Bob Joyce finally said something. And what he said, the words he chose, the way he framed them, the things he acknowledged and the things he very carefully did not, turned out to be far more complicated than anyone who had been waiting for a clean answer was prepared for. Before we go any further, we need to slow down for a moment. Because in all the noise, all the viral videos and the conspiracy threads and the late-night rabbit holes, something important has gotten lost. And that something is the actual human being at the center of this story. Not the theory, not the comparison, not the internet's version of who Bob Joyce might be. The real man, the one who shows up every week, stands behind a pulpit, and pours himself into the lives of the people sitting in those pews. Bob Joyce has been the pastor of Benton First Baptist Church in Benton, Arkansas for decades. That's not a footnote, that's a life. A full, committed, deeply rooted life built around faith and community and service. The people who know him, the ones who have sat under his ministry for years, describe him in consistent terms. They talk about his warmth, his sincerity, the way he makes every person in the room feel genuinely seen and cared for. They talk about a man who is present not just on Sunday mornings, but in the hardest moments of their lives, at hospital bedsides, at grave sites, in the quiet aftermath of loss when most people don't know what to say, and Bob Joyce somehow always does. By every account from the people who actually know him, he is exactly what he appears to be. A devoted pastor, a man of deep and unshakable faith, someone who chose a life of quiet significance over a life of noise and spectacle. And that, in a strange way, is precisely what makes this story so difficult to dismiss. Because when you look at Bob Joyce, really look at him, not through the lens of conspiracy, but through the lens of simple human observation, something pulls at you. The jaw, the hairline, the way he holds himself when he sings, that particular stillness in the upper body with all the emotion channeled through the voice rather than the performance, and then the voice itself, which we have already discussed, but which bears returning to because no description of it fully does it justice until you have actually heard it. It carries a resonance that is almost architectural, the kind of voice that doesn't just fill a room, but seems to change the pressure inside it. And if you grew up listening to Elvis Presley, if his music is woven into the fabric of your memory in the way it is for tens of millions of people around the world, then hearing Bob Joyce sing is a genuinely disorienting experience. Not because it is a perfect imitation, but because it doesn't feel like an imitation at all. Vocal analysts, not conspiracy theorists, but people with actual training in the mechanics of the human voice, have pointed to specific technical markers that the two voices share. The tonal placement, the vibrato pattern, the way certain consonants are softened and certain vowels are extended in a manner that is not regional, not stylistic, but deeply physiological. These are characteristics that cannot be easily taught or learned because they originate in the physical structure of the instrument itself. The shape of the throat, the resonance of the chest cavity, the particular architecture of a human body that produces sound in one specific way and no other. And when those analysts placed recordings of the two voices side by side, what they found was not general similarity. It was granular, measurable, specific overlap that by any standard framework of vocal analysis should not exist between two unrelated individuals. That is the detail that turned casual observers into true believers. That is the thread that, once pulled, unraveled the skepticism of people who had come to the comparison looking for an easy debunking and left instead with a notebook full of unanswered questions. The theory itself, the one that insists Bob Joyce, is Elvis Presley living under an assumed identity after faking his death in 1977, has been circulating in various forms since the early days of the internet. But the version centered on Bob Joyce gained traction in a way the others never quite managed, because it came attached to something the other theories lacked. A face. A voice. A living, breathing, findable human being who bore a resemblance, physical and vocal, that was not a matter of imagination or wishful thinking. It was right there on the screen for anyone to see and hear and judge for themselves. And that accessibility, that tangibility, gave the theory a kind of gravitational pull that kept drawing people back even after they thought they had moved on. Even hardened skeptics, people who rolled their eyes at the very premise and clicked on the comparison videos purely to satisfy their own sense of superiority, found themselves pausing, rewinding, tilting their heads, watching one more time. Because there is a difference between a theory that asks you to believe something and a theory that makes you feel something. And this one lands firmly in the second category. Which brings us back to the question that has sat at the heart of this story from the very beginning. If Bob Joyce is simply a gifted pastor from Arkansas who happens to share certain vocal qualities with the most famous singer in history, then why, through years of mounting public obsession, has he never stood up and said so with the kind of clarity and force that would end the conversation for good? What has he actually said? And what has he been so careful never to say? More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. There is a particular kind of silence that is not passive. It is not the silence of someone who hasn't noticed the noise around them or someone who simply doesn't care enough to respond. It is a deliberate silence. A chosen silence, the kind that requires daily maintenance and quiet discipline, because the world keeps knocking and the silence keeps having to be rebuilt from scratch every single morning. That is the silence Bob Joyce maintained for years, while the internet built an entire cathedral of theory and speculation around his voice, his face, and his very existence. And when that silence finally cracked, when he finally addressed the comparisons that had followed him through years of ministry and viral notoriety, the world leaned in expecting one thing and received something else entirely. What most people expected was a wall, a firm, unambiguous, slightly exasperated denial from a man of faith who had grown tired of being confused with a dead rock and roll legend. They expected the pastoral equivalent of a cease and desist, a clear, dignified statement that separated him from the mythology once and for all and allowed everyone involved to move on with their lives. That is what the rational arc of the story seemed to demand. And in a simpler version of this story, that is exactly what would have happened. But Bob Joyce is not a simple man, and this has never been a simple story. When Joyce addressed the comparisons, he did so with the same measured, unhurried quality that characterizes everything about his public presence. He acknowledged the attention. He acknowledged that people had noticed the similarities, and that the videos comparing his voice to Elvis had reached an audience far beyond anything he could have anticipated or controlled. He spoke about it with a kind of gentle bemusement, the way a man might discuss an unexpected storm that passed through his town, something that happened to him rather than something he had any hand in creating. And on the surface, reading those words quickly, it could sound like a denial. It could sound like a man calmly stepping back from a story that doesn't belong to him. But listen more carefully. Read more slowly. Because what Bob Joyce said and what Bob Joyce did not say are two very different things, and the gap between them is where this story continues to live. He did not say the comparisons were absurd. He did not express the kind of genuine bewilderment that a person typically expresses when they are being associated with something that has absolutely no basis in reality. He did not laugh it off the way an innocent man with nothing complicated to carry usually laughs things off. The tone was not defensive, which one might expect, but it was also not fully dismissive in the way that a clean conscience usually produces clean dismissals. It was careful, layered. The words of a man who had thought very deliberately about exactly how much to say and had chosen with equal deliberateness to stop just short of saying all of it. And the people who had followed this story the longest noticed. They always notice. On one side of the debate, there were those who took his statement at face value and felt the matter was settled. They argued that a pastor, a man whose entire life is built on honesty and integrity and standing before his congregation as a vessel of truth, would not lie about something this significant. They argued that his willingness to address it at all was itself a form of courage, and that reading darkness into a measured response was the kind of motivated reasoning that conspiracy thinking always produces. These people closed their browsers, unsubscribed from the comparison channels, and moved on. But on the other side were the people who felt something shift when they read his words. Not toward certainty, nobody moved toward certainty, but toward a deeper, stranger uncertainty than the one they had been carrying before. Because a denial that doesn't fully deny is not a denial. It is something else. Something that sits in the chest and refuses to dissolve no matter how many times you tell yourself you're reading too much into it. And then consider what it actually means to be Bob Joyce in this moment. Set aside the theory entirely. Set aside Elvis and Graceland and 1977 and all of it. Just imagine being a man of faith. A man who has spent his entire adult life in service to something larger than himself, and waking up every morning to find that a significant portion of the world has decided that your life is not your own, that your voice, your face, your very identity is evidence in someone else's story, that no matter what you do or say, there is a narrative running parallel to your real life that you cannot fully enter and cannot fully escape. That is not a conspiracy. That is a psychological reality, and it is one that most people are entirely unprepared to sit with. What Bob Joyce carried in that silence for all those years was not nothing, and what he finally released into the world with his statement was not everything. Somewhere between those two things, between the silence and the statement, between what was said and what was withheld, the truth of this story is still breathing, still waiting, still refusing to be neatly resolved. And when he spoke, the conversation did not end. It exploded. New videos, new analysts, new voices flooding into a debate that his statement was supposed to close. Some silences, when broken, only make the world louder. Let's step back from the details for a moment. Let's step back from the vocal analyses and the jaw structure comparisons and the carefully parsed statements and the forum threads that run for hundreds of pages. Let's step all the way back and ask the question that sits underneath all of it. The question that nobody in this debate ever quite gets around to asking directly. because it feels too large, too uncomfortable, too honest. Why do we need Elvis Presley to still be alive? Not why do conspiracy theorists need it. Not why do the people who built YouTube channels around the comparison need it. Why does the culture, the broad, sprawling, multi-generational culture that has carried Elvis's legacy for nearly 5 decades since his death, why does it need him to still be somewhere on this earth, still breathing, still singing, even if only to a congregation in Arkansas on Sunday mornings? Because that need is real, and it is the engine that has driven every single chapter of this story. These are things that live in the body from decades of use. And then there's the faith layer, which is perhaps the most important piece of context that casual observers tend to skip past. Elvis Presley was not performatively religious. His relationship with gospel music and with God was not a PR strategy or a Southern affectation. It was the bedrock of who he was. The people closest to him knew it. Then there's Vernon Presley, Elvis's father. A man who by every account loved his son with a completeness that defined his entire existence. People who were present in the days immediately following the death announcement described Vernon's behavior as strange in ways they struggled to articulate, not the paralyzed, disintegrating grief of a father who had just lost his only child, but something more complicated, something that flickered, at moments, with an emotion that didn't quite match the occasion. These are subjective observations reported by human beings with their own biases and limitations, but they were made, they were documented, and they haven't disappeared. Now bring Bob Joyce back into the frame. Because he hasn't been silent on this. He knows the theory exists, he knows millions of people have watched videos about him, analyzed his voice, compared his face to old photographs, and concluded, some of them with genuine conviction, that he is Elvis Presley living under a different name in a Baptist church in Arkansas. And he has addressed it. He has sat in front of cameras and denied it, calmly and with what appears to be good humor, the way a man addresses a rumor he finds more absurd than threatening. But fans, the ones who have watched those denials frame by frame, the ones who study this the way other people study case law, point to something in those moments that they find more unnerving than reassuring. The smile that arrives a half second too early. The answer that redirects rather than refutes. The particular brand of patience he shows when discussing it, the kind of patience that doesn't look like a man tired of a ridiculous accusation. It looks like a man who has made peace with carrying a secret. These are interpretations. They could be wrong. But they are consistent, and they keep being reported by people who watch the footage independently of each other. And then there is the silence that speaks louder than any of it. Bob Joyce has never taken a public DINA test. He is under absolutely no legal or moral obligation to do so. That much is unambiguous. A private citizen does not owe the internet a biological confirmation of his identity. But we live in a world where a single cheek swab, processed by any number of widely available consumer genetic testing services, would end this conversation permanently and completely. It would close the file. It would silence the theorists, vindicate the skeptics, and give Bob Joyce his privacy back in a way that no denial ever fully has. The test has not happened. The demand for one has not been met. And in the absence of that resolution, the question does not shrink. It breathes. Here's what this story is really about. Underneath all the evidence and the counter-arguments and the biographical gaps and the voice comparisons, it is about grief. It is about the particular, irrational, deeply human refusal to accept that someone who mattered that much is simply gone. Elvis Presley didn't just make music. He made people feel something about themselves, about their own capacity for joy, for longing, for the kind of beauty that doesn't apologize for itself. And when that disappears from the world looks for it. It keeps looking. It finds a voice in a church in Arkansas, and it holds on. Because holding on feels better than letting go. Whether Bob Joyce is Elvis Presley or not, the reason millions of people need him to be says everything about what Elvis meant, and nothing about what is actually true. Maybe the question was never really, is Pastor Bob Joyce Elvis Presley? Maybe the real question is, why does it matter so much that he might be? And why, after nearly 50 years, does the answer still feel just out of reach? Elvis Presley was not simply a musician. That framing is technically accurate and completely insufficient at the same time. He was a rupture in the fabric of American culture, a moment before and a moment after, a line drawn in the middle of the 20th century that separated the world that existed from the world that became possible. He didn't just change music, he changed the way a body could move in public, the way a voice could carry desire and anguish and joy simultaneously, the way a working-class kid from Tupelo, Mississippi could walk into a recording studio with nothing but raw instinct, and walk out having rewritten the rules of what a human being could be in front of an audience. He was singular in a way that the word singular barely contains. And then he was gone. Not gracefully, not at the end of a long life well lived, surrounded by the people he loved, with time to say everything that needed to be said. He was gone at 42, broken down by decades of pressure and excess and the specific cruelty of a world that consumed him so completely that very little of him was left by the end. The autopsy photos leaked. The tabloids descended. The image of how he died, alone on a bathroom floor in Graceland, became almost inseparable from the image of who he was. And for the people who had loved him most fiercely, that ending was simply not acceptable. It did not fit the size of the man. It did not fit the magnitude of what he had meant. And so the alternative took root. Quietly at first, then loudly, then permanently. The idea that Elvis had seen what was coming, had recognized that the life he was living would destroy him completely, and had made the extraordinary decision to walk away from it. To shed the name and the fame and the sequin jumpsuits and the handlers and the hangers-on and simply disappear into an ordinary life where nobody expected anything from him. And he could finally, after decades of being the most watched human being on the planet, just breathe. It is a fantasy. Yes, but it is a fantasy with such emotional logic, such internal coherence, that it has outlasted every debunking and every rational counter-argument thrown at it for 47 years. Because it doesn't ask you to believe in something impossible, it asks you to believe in something deeply human. The desire to escape, the desire to start over, the desire to be free. And then Bob Joyce opened his mouth and sang. Into that landscape of longing and unresolved grief and decades of stubborn hope, a voice arrived that sounded like an answer. Not a confirmed answer, not a provable answer, but an answer that felt true in the place where feelings live before facts get to them. And for the people who had been waiting, and there were more of them than the rational world would ever admit, it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Now here is the part of this story that carries the most weight. The part that stays with you after the video ends and the screen goes dark and you're lying in bed, staring at the ceiling at midnight, turning it over in your mind. There are only two ways this story ends. Two possible truths sitting at the bottom of all of it. In the first, Bob Joyce is exactly who he says he is. A gifted, faithful, deeply sincere pastor from Arkansas who was born with an extraordinary voice and the misfortune, or perhaps the strange distinction, of sounding remarkably like the most famous singer in history. In that version, he is a man whose privacy and identity have been complicated in ways most people will never fully understand, who has carried the weight of someone else's mythology on his shoulders through years of ministry and service, and who deserves the simple dignity of being seen as himself. And in the second version, the version that logic resists and something deeper refuses to entirely rule out, the greatest entertainer who ever lived has been standing in a church in Arkansas all along, singing hymns, shaking hands, watching the world slowly, painstakingly, inch its way toward a truth he has never confirmed and never fully denied. Either way, something about this story is heartbreaking. And either way, it is not over. The voice is still out there. The questions are still alive. And the silence, even now, even after everything that has been said, is still louder than the answers. If this story hit you the way it hit us, drop a comment below and tell us what you actually believe. And if you're not subscribed yet, do it right now, because the Elvis rabbit hole goes deeper than you think, and we are just getting started.